Hi, I'm recording this less than 24 hours after the assassination of Charlie Kirk, and in that short amount of time, you'll probably have already noticed that if you try to seek out any images or raw video from the event, most news organizations have already blurred it, even providing warnings ahead of time saying disturbing imagery. They've already blurred out the imagery that you're about to see itself. So this is something that has been happening probably since the birth of photography. Since photography and film and video came into existence, there have been photographs, film, and videos of public actions of violence. And there's been a long history of censoring that imagery for the general public. Going all the way back to, say, Matthew Brady's photos of battlefields in the Civil War, the photos, especially those that contained a number of dead soldiers laying on the battlefield, were not published by newspapers in their original form. They were usually made into lithographs that subdued the violence the reader of the paper was seeing. It kind of, in a strange way, romanticized it and didn't give you that full blunt imagery that Matthew Brady's photographs provided. At the same time, there's also a long history of actual violence in the real world being photographed, filmed, or videotaped and being shown. As far back as Ruth Snyder's execution in the electric chair in the 1920s, and that being photographed and secretly and published in many newspapers across the country. People got to see that. And with basic wartime photographs from World War II, they still weren't showing the absolute worst, but once they got to Vietnam, news crews and journalists tended to film and photograph things that the general public were simply not used to seeing. Public execution on the streets of Saigon by revolver in 1968. Those Vietnam photographs of, say, children fleeing from a napalm bombing in terror and pain, those kinds of photographs and the film that often accompanied them had an immeasurable impact on the way people felt about the war. It had an impact that started to change the way people felt about those things in general. There was a much greater resistance across the world to people fighting in the Vietnam War because of that imagery. And as the real world imagery became less censored, so did the fictional imagery of the cinematic world. Any lover of classic film knows that oftentimes when people are shot in movies, say from the 30s or the 40s or even the 50s, there's no blood, but there's often not even a bullet hole. There's no squib, there's no little explosion. They just literally clutch their chest and die. It's all bloodless and there's no gore whatsoever. That started to change too, especially in the 1960s, kind of alongside the media releasing more graphic footage of events that were occurring. However, that did start to change. The powers that be weren't very happy with the impact that imagery from Vietnam had on the general public, and the U.S. government and other governments around the world did start to restrict journalists to certain areas they could go to and what they could photograph and film. And that's around the time it started to really take hold, this full kind of censorship of imagery on the whole. When Vincent Bugliosi released his book in 1974, I believe, Helter Skelter, about the Manson murders, it contained photographs from the murder scenes. But in those photographs, the actual bodies of the victims were whited out so that you could not see the blood and gore surrounding their murders. And of course, now when any event like what happened with Charlie Kirk happens, we find that news organizations will blur that out as well. But the question is, should they? It is a hotly debated question, and I land squarely on the side of they should not be blurring anything out. I grew up in a time when violent imagery was shown with far more regularity, and I was a child seeing a lot of this. In 1987, when Bud Dwyer shockingly committed suicide on camera, that was shown everywhere, again and again and again. I saw that happen on the news probably dozens of times within the first few days of it happening. Things like that I saw up close and personal on the TV. I saw other images from other assassination attempts or full-on assassinations, like Anwar Sadat. I saw them. As a child, I saw these things. And what it did was produce in me a revulsion against violence. I mean, not only did it not have an adverse effect on me, I grew up and had a terrific career and a loving relationship. I've raised 4 children. I feel like there's a disservice done when we can't see the imagery. I feel like we would have made much greater strides towards fixing the problems of violence in our society if we were exposed to the actual imagery of those events. When there's a school shooting and we don't see the imagery, it can remain in our minds as an abstract. And if it remains in our minds as an abstract, then we don't necessarily push to the limits what we need to do about that. Another good example of this is when Emmett Till was lynched and brutally murdered in 1955 by a pair of white racists. And his body and his face, he was 14 years old. It was so badly deformed from the beating and the shooting and the drowning of his body that his mother, Mamie Till Bradley, wanted an open casket because she wanted people to see what had happened to her son by white supremacist murderers. That event, that public showing of Emmett Till's face, is often considered one of the most important moments of the modern civil rights movement for showing America and the world just what black people in the United States of America were up against. Showing Emmett Till's face was an act of courage on the part of Mamie Till Bradley that cannot be understated. And she understood that censoring or blurring or not showing it at all would relegate the death of her son to an abstract. Were we to view those images from, say, school shootings, would it change everything? No, I don't think for a second that it would. But I think it would have an impact on a lot of people in positive ways that make them fight for change harder. I don't think that media outlets protecting us fragile viewers from seeing things really does any good, because it keeps it all in the abstract. It keeps it all as just a news item instead of an event that obviously impacts us, obviously impacts the lives of the families of the victims of these events. Obviously, it impacts people in so many different ways. I feel like you have to be horrified. You have to be horrified to the point that you have almost no choice but to stand up and stand against these acts of violence. So history may have plenty of examples going all the way back to the beginning of censoring acts of violence that have been photographed or filmed or videotaped, but it also has plenty of examples, mainly and specifically those coming out of the Vietnam War, where actions were not censored and did in fact have a great positive impact as a result. Just to go back quickly to the live suicide of Bud Dwyer, you still will have a hard time finding footage to that, even though every news organization at the time ran it repeatedly. Now it repeatedly gets taken down or censored online so that people can't see it. I understand that from the victims' perspective, the family of the victims, certainly. But for society as a whole, I think it is a necessary thing for people to be able to see the actual photographed results of violence if we are to take it on in our society in any realistic way. We have to experience it in a way that shocks our senses. That's all I've got for this time around. Thank you for watching, and please be safe. Thank you.